Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We're still reading from the lectures by Swami Abhedananda on the self. And we're in the middle of 3 lectures. This one's called The Realization of the Self. But a couple of sessions ago, I said that it would have been nice to have had a song from the Vivekananda oratorio, because, of course, the things that Swami Vivekananda taught were very much the same as the things that Swami Abhedananda was talking about. So we're going to start with a song from that oratorio, and these are the words. The Lord is the omnipresent one without a second, for he has interpenetrated the whole universe, the pure, the great poet of the universe, whose meter is the sun and the stars. He is everywhere, everywhere, everywhere the pure and stainless one. And a couple of weeks ago, Swami Vedanta expressed those sentiments in very much similar words.
Oh knowledge of this book. In this sense, the Atman can never be known or made an object of knowledge. Now let us understand this clearly. When we speak of knowing a thing, we mean relative knowledge by intellect. And we convey the same idea when we say we do not know a thing. Again, intellect can reveal those things which are related to the senses or are subject to sense perception. It is more or less dependent upon sense powers, and consequently, its sphere is very limited. The senses can reach only within a small and limited circle. For instance, we hear sound through our ears. The sound is audible within a certain degree of vibration. The vibration of air be above or below that scale, we cannot hear. And although there may be a tremendous noise, still our ears are deaf to it. The same may be said of the eye. The range of sight is equally narrow. Now we can see how very limited that intellect must be, which depends upon these powers of perception. Therefore, that intellectual knowledge, which is related to sense perceptions, is secondary knowledge, cannot reveal the self. Hence it is said that the self is far from the known. Furthermore, when we say we do not know this thing, we mean that we are conscious of our ignorance. We have the knowledge of the fact that we do not understand it or know it by intellect. This ignorance is nothing but the lack of the intellectual apprehension of the thing which we have called secondary knowledge. It is, however, revealed to us by another knowledge which does not depend upon intellect or upon sense perception. That perception by which we know that we do not know this thing proceeds from the self. Therefore, the self is neither known nor unknown, but beyond relative knowledge and ignorance. We've heard it from our great masters who passed away before us. Although this Upanishad of the Samaveda is very old, still the teacher here refers to the authority of other seers of truth who preceded him and from whom self-knowledge had been handed down through generations.
Yes, so it's the self is something that you can't know in the ordinary sense, and that's why we call it transcendent, because ordinary knowledge is through the senses, and so this is transcendent. And as one seer put it that I had the privilege of meeting, he said, when you experience your samadhi, it's like consciousness goes from 0 to infinity. In other words, there isn't any comparison. You can't compare the two. It's simply beyond our comprehension to understand what it is to know the self, or to know Brahman, or to realize God, however you want to put it. All of those are just phrases to describe this process that is, in some sense, indescribable. And yet we know that people experience that state, and they try their best to explain it to us, what it's like. And of course, the goal of spiritual practices is for us to also experience that type of state. And we can see that people get glimpses of this. It's not necessarily an all or nothing thing, but we can get closer and closer to that understanding of it, even though it might be just an intellectual understanding. There's something which becomes more confirming all the time as you do your spiritual practices. You begin to feel the reality of the self as being the witness of everything, and not something that is that you're conscious of. It is that which allows you to be conscious. And of course, the self is, in Sanskrit, the Atman, and Atman is Brahman. So the same types of descriptions of Brahman apply to the Atman. It is existence absolute, consciousness or knowledge absolute, and bliss absolute. And it's not really three things. It's not like you have to go through spiritual disciplines to experience existence, and then another set to experience consciousness, and another set to experience bliss. You get them, it's one thing. It's like the mysterious way this universe is created. When we see a universe that's in space and time with the process of causation. And in space and time, we see particles all divided up, and they're all finite. Now, all of those come together. You can't have space without time. You can't have things that are all spaced out if they're not small. So all of these things come together. It's not like you get one, it's like you get space, and then you get time, and then you get causation. You don't get things seen as divided and then see them as finite and then see them as changing. It all happens at once. It's an apparition happens at once. If you mistake a rope for a snake, you don't first mistake the frayed end of the rope for the head, and then the other frayed end for the tail, and then, but the rest of it still looks like a rope. The mistake happens all at once, and it's something you're doing now. It's not something you do gradually, or that is some event in time. It's something that we're doing now. All right, let's continue with the next paragraph.
The Master said, that which cannot be expressed by speech, but which is the speaker and director of speech, know that alone is the highest self, Brahman, not that which people worship here. Every attribute that we give to God is not his attribute in reality. We can, but he is not merely good, strictly speaking. He is beyond good and evil.
I think that was supposed to be call. I think the scanner thought the N was, or the two L's was an N.
Mm-hmm. We call him good, but he is not merely good, strictly speaking. He is beyond good and evil. We project our idea of good, mentally separate it from evil, and increasing its dimension, attribute it to the infinite being, and call him good. At the same time, we forget that what is good demands something better, and that better again requires something which is best. This shows how foolish we are when we seem to be contented after calling him good. God is in reality beyond our conception of good, which is relative and limited. In this manner, it can be shown that every attribute which we can think of, nay, every word which we can utter, is finite in its meaning and idea. Yet, if we go a little deeper, we shall find that no thought can exist and no word can be uttered unless there be the self-conscious thinker and speaker behind. This self-consciousness is caused by the light of intelligence which proceeds from the self. Therefore, the self is the absolute truth, inexpressible by speech. It is the illuminator of speech, but it can never be illumined by words. Is self, the Atman, the same thing which is worshipped by all the great devotees and worshippers of God? Is it some personal God dwelling outside of us and directing our minds and senses by will and command? Is self the same being who is called by different names, as Father in heaven, or Allah, whom we worship with prayers and offerings? Is the Atman the same as an angel or bright spirit? What is it? Reading the mental question of his pupil, the Master said, not that which people worship here. The worshiper of a personal God with a name and form is not the worshiper of the absolute truth, because he worships the phenomenal God. Name and form, being both phenomenal, our conception of the divinity with a name and form is phenomenal and anthropomorphic, or in other words, we create an ideal God by projecting our ideas, give him attributes according to our conception, and then worshiping by offering him our prayers. Prayers are nothing but words. We send these words to the personal God in order to obtain certain results. But he, to whom we pray with words, is not the director of speech. That self which is in us and makes us speak and pray is different from him whom we worship with prayers. The personal God with a form and a name is not the highest. This may seem strange to us, but we cannot deny it. God with a name and a form who can be described by words and thought or by our minds is not the absolute. There is a saying, when God is known, he is no longer God. He is our imagination. The absolute divinity is different from what is worshipped.
Yeah, it's an important point to remember that all the gods and goddesses are just as much a part of Maya as all the human beings and all the things in the universe are. Anything in the manifest universe is part of Maya, and this is just a subtle realm of the universe. And so the various gods and goddesses are simply subtle manifestations of archetypal energies, you could say, in the universe, representing certain qualities and conditions. And you could say, in some sense, that the absolute then has to be the sum total of all of the possible interpretations of the divinity, all the possible manifestations of God with name and form, but it's not any one of them. It has to be beyond name and form. It has to be beyond words. In fact, in some places it says every time you try to describe God, it's you're defiling him. You can't describe Brahman with words. But we have to have a spiritual practice. We're here in Maya, and we have to use things within Maya in order to have a spiritual practice to get us out of it. And so all of these concepts are crutches, you could say, within the realm of Maya that we're using here. And so it's not like we're poo-pooing these ideas. These are all very useful ideas. And we can use our prayers and our attitudes towards God with devotion as a means to an end. And once that realization of the personal God is obtained, that personal God, your chosen deity, your Ishtadevata, leads you to the realm of the absolute, the infinite. Okay, let's read another paragraph or two.
Again, what can be thought by the mind is not the absolute truth, or Brahman. Therefore the Master said, that which cannot be cognized by the mind, but by which all mental functions are cognized, know that to be your true self, but not that which people worship.
You know, I think that's why one of the practices in Zen Buddhism is the contemplation of koans, which are sayings that don't really have an answer. And you're supposed to kind of exhaust your mind into wordless contemplation of the mysteries of the universe rather than trying to understand it in some sort of mental concept. It forces you to kind of drop the mental word constructs. All right, let's read another paragraph.
That which cannot be perceived by the eye, by which the eyes are made to see, know that to be the self, the absolute Brahman, not that which people worship. That which cannot be heard by the ear, but by which the ear is made capable of hearing a sound, know that to be the self, the absolute Brahman, not that which people worship. That which cannot be perceived by the power of smell, but by which the organ of smell perceives odor, know that to be the self, the absolute Brahman, and not that which people worship. These verses show that the self, the true self, who is the director of the mind and senses, is not the same as the personal God whom people worship, but is one and the same Brahman, the absolute truth.
Okay.
Having heard this, the seeker after self-knowledge went into meditation and searched for the illuminator or director of the mind, which is beyond the reach of our thoughts, words, and sense powers. He spent some time in samadhi, or the superconscious state, and realizing the self, he returned to the ordinary plane of consciousness and said, I have known and realized the absolute truth. I have known the self. The master replied, if you think that you know the self, then you know very little of it. If you believe that you have known the absolute Brahman perfectly, you have known very little of the truth which dwells in you as well as in the universe. Because truth is one. When you begin to think that you have known the truth, you are using your secondary knowledge of the intellect, which cannot reveal the absolute. If you imagine that you have known the self of Brahman, who is the director of the mind, you have comprehended very little of it. And if you think that you have realized it as dwelling in your body, you have not understood its absolute nature. If you believe that you have cognized it as dwelling outside your body, still you have not realized the truth. If you've known the self as God, the creator of the universe, you have apprehended very little of it.
Yes, it's like the blind man and the elephant, and just feeling one part of the elephant and trying to understand the whole elephant. It's all of these and none of these, because it can't really be put in any of these categories, and yet it makes it possible for all of these things to exist. As the words to the song said, interpenetrates all of the entire world and expresses itself like a great poet. And so this manifest universe is the poetic splendor of the divine, and yet it's not any one part of that splendor. It's beyond it as well. And so it's inscrutable. It's not something that we can understand with our intellect. It's both within us and without us. It's not just one or the other. And so it's very easy to think we have an understanding of it, and yet whatever we understand is probably still just a partial understanding, or possibly even a misunderstanding. And it's an infinite. How can you know the infinite in terms of the intellect? The intellect is a limited concept, but your true self is one with the infinite. So your existence is the absolute. So let's read another paragraph here.
Here the question arises, why is it that we have known very little of the self if we have known it as dwelling in our body? Because that something which is the director of the mind does not dwell in one place. It is beyond the space relation. Therefore, when we have known it as dwelling in a particular place, not anywhere else, we have not realized the truth. Again, if we have perceived it as dwelling outside of us and not in us, then also we have not known that this being is all-pervading and beyond the relation of time and space. But we have known only that much of the infinite, which is limited by time and space and conditioned by their relations. Then the disciple sat in meditation once more, and his soul, rising above the plane of thoughts, entered into the superconscious state. Having remained there for some time, he came back to the plane of sense consciousness and declared, "I do not think I know the self well, nor do I know that I do not know it at all. The self is neither to be known, nor is it the same as that which is absolutely unknown. He who has known this truth has realized it, the absolute Brahman." What he meant by this was that self-knowledge is beyond relative knowledge and ignorance. Whatever we know by the understanding is only possible through the light of intelligence which proceeds from the true self. There's no other knower of the self who is the illuminator of mind and thoughts. The self is, in reality, the eternal knower. There's nothing in the universe that can know the true self. Yet it is the source of all the true knowledge that we possess. It is always the subject of knowledge or consciousness, but never its object. Furthermore, the disciple said, "He who thinks that the self can never become an object of knowledge thinks rightly. But he who thinks I have known it has not realized its true nature. The self is not known by those who think it is known, but it is realized by those who think it is not known."
And you know, when one reaches that state of knowledge, one sees that Brahman is interpenetrating this entire universe, that every living and non-living thing is a result of that energy of Brahman being present in it. And so they actually see the universe that way. And yet they've also seen the absolute truth. And of course, other people can get glimpses of this type of experience, and you can cultivate that type of experience, trying to see the oneness in the universe and trying to see the divinity in the universe. And some examples from, say, nature mystics, you could say, are people like the people at Findhorn who saw all the devas in the environment as helping them. And so that's one way of approaching this concept that the divinity is interpenetrating everything and that it can help you and guide you. George Washington Carver also had that type of experience. He would go out and communicate with the plants and ask them how they could best be used. And so he had this idea that consciousness is pervading in the plant. Same with Luther Burbank. He communicated with the plants and asked them to do things for him in his hybridizing efforts and so forth. And so these people have at least an approach to that and getting a little closer to that idea that they see the wonder of the infinite, undivided, unchanging Brahman within the manifest universe. But you don't want to get stuck there either and think that seeing devas or hearing divine voices is the ultimate in spiritual life. But it's at least a step closer and gives you a hint of that experience that comes naturally to those when they have realized the self. All right, let's continue.
This seems an enigma. What does it mean? If we analyze our perceptions, what do we find? When we see a color, we find that the sensation of color is produced by light, which is a certain kind of vibration of the ether. A ray of light coming in contact with the retina causes some kind of molecular change in them. And this being carried by the optic nerves into the brain cells creates certain molecular vibration in those cells. It requires a conscious ego to translate this vibration into a sensation, which we perceive and call color. If the conscious ego is not there, then these vibrations may be carried to the brain centers, where they may produce other changes. Still, we shall not see the color. For instance, when we are looking at a color, if our mind be suddenly distracted or concentrated on some other object, the color may remain before our eyes, yet we do not see it. Although the vibration of light has been carried to the brain centers, the molecular changes have been formed and all the physiological conditions are fulfilled. Still, we have no sensation of color because there is no one to translate the molecular vibrations of the brain cells into the sensation of color. The ego who translates them is concentrated on something else. But when the changes are translated by the ego into sensations, we perceive it.
And of course, we know that these kinds of things can also be, that your brain can be tricked, that the perception of colors, for example, if you stare at a bright colored wall for a long time, those cones in your eyes get so tired that when you look away, you see the complementary color in the other direction. And so because those cones have been exhausted, and so you then see the complementary color to the one that you've just been staring at, even though that complementary color may not be over there at all. So, and of course, there are all sorts of optical illusions which our brain tries to make sense out of and does it incorrectly. So our sense of perception is very much dependent on the way the brain is wired. And of course, different animals have their brains wired differently depending on what they need to survive. It's all very dependent on the need for survival. And so some animals are more prone to seeing motion. And so anything that moves, they said their attention is suddenly drawn to it. The bees can see in certain wavelengths of light that we can't see, but they can pick up when a flower is ready, is producing its nectar, and that it's a good time to go visit the flower to get its sustenance. So all of these things are programmed into the organisms. And so our sense organs are, as I like to say, there are nonsense organs. They present a picture of the world that's not the reality. It's not telling us what the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality is. It's painting some other picture which was designed for survival and not for much of anything else. So we'll continue here. Let's see what else he has to say, and then we're going to play another song. So.
Now let us go a little deeper. Behind this intellectual perception, there's the self-consciousness of the ego. If the ego be unconscious, and if there be no sense of it, these vibrations will come through the senses and pass away without producing any sensation in the mind. Again, if the mind be separated from the source of appreciation and intelligence, the sensations will remain in the subconscious mind without affecting the conscious ego. This source of consciousness in us is the knower. It is our true self. We know that we are sitting here. When we walk, we know that we are walking. When we perform an act, we know that we are performing it. This knower of all acts and thoughts is the director. Is that knowledge different from our true self? No, it is inseparable from our self. Our true self is like a sea of intelligence. Some people say that knowledge proceeds from the self, or in other words, that from which this knowledge proceeds is the self. That would imply that the self is separate from knowledge, and would raise the question, What is then the nature of the true self? According to monistic Vedanta, the nature of the self, or Atman or Brahman, is absolute knowledge or absolute intelligence, which never changes. The functions of the intellect and mind are changeable, but self-knowledge is unchangeable. Suppose you have a feeling. When it rises, you feel it. You know that there is that feeling. When it subsides and another takes its place, then also you know that the new feeling is there. The knowledge by which you cognize each feeling cannot be known by any other knowledge. There is only one knowledge in the universe. Consequently, the knower of that knowledge cannot be known by any other knowledge. That by which you know the existence of a feeling or sensation cannot be revealed by intellect, understanding, or any other faculty. Upon it depends intellectual understanding. Whenever we perceive any object through the senses, that knowledge is a partial expression of the self, or absolute knowledge, which directs the mind and senses to perform their functions.
All right, so we're going to close with another song from the Vivekananda Oratorio. And this one, I think, gives us an idea of, again, one way to practice, just as we mentioned how you can try to practice seeing the divine interpenetrating all living and non-living things. You can also do that by doing service to others and seeing the oneness in all things. So this song is about that oneness, and it says, there is the oneness of the whole universe, this solidarity of the whole universe. When we realize it and see it, feel it, then will misery and fear cease. From the lowest worm under our feet to the highest being that ever lived, all have various bodies, but are the one soul universal. From the great ideal of oneness has come the great ideal of universal love. Fear ceases, and then alone comes perfect happiness and perfect love. That eternal universal love and bliss that raises us above everything. God is present in every being. There is no other God. Do you love your fellow beings? Oh, where shall you go to seek for God? Are not the poor God? Are not the weak God? Are not the sick and the helpless God? God is present in every being that you serve. Believe in the omnipotent power of love. Its power of love is infinitely greater than the power of hate. The sum total of all love is God. Oh, God is love. Love is God. Have you universal love? Then you are omnipotent. Are you perfectly unselfish? Then you are irresistible. Believe in the omnipotent power of love, where love shall win the victory. It's going to take me a moment to cue this up. Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with from under the things we see, filled with from under the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is, from Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.